Welcome to the latest episode of Sustainability Talks. I'm your host, Patrick Sheehan, Managing Partner of ETF Partners. We're Europe's leading venture capital firm focused on backing businesses that deliver what we call sustainability through innovation. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Michael Liebreich, Chairman and CEO of Liebreich Associates and co-managing partner of EcoPragma Capital. Michael's a member of the UK's Task Force on Energy Efficiency, chairing a subgroup on industry, a member of the UK Board of Trade, an honorary fellow of the Energy Institute, a visiting professor at Imperial College London. I could go on. On top of that, he's a former advisor to the UN on sustainable energy for all, a former member of the Board of Transport for London, and the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Today's going to be a lively discussion. We'll dive into the state of technology needed to achieve net zero carbon emissions. We'll also address the trends in renewable energy and why there has historically been a delay in its rollout, and ultimately what needs to change in order for it to move forward more quickly. Particularly, we'll explore how a mix of different technologies is necessary for success and how collaboration between stakeholders is key. Lastly, we will examine the critical role governments have to play in incentivizing and supporting innovation in this sector. This episode promises to be an engaging and informative conversation about net zero transitions and renewable energy trends. Michael, I'm really looking forward to this talk, actually. And the purpose of it is to help me, our audience, understand better the technological revolution required to make the transition to net zero possible. But that's the headline. I'd like to start on why you and I are talking, actually. Maybe you could explain your background and how you got to the position you've got to today as a kind of a sought-after speaker on the subject.
Yeah, hi, Patrick. It's always an enormous pleasure to see you and to speak with you. And of course, these are topics that are, close to both of our hearts. My journey, it's very much, I always say it's a bit like it's very much the Steve Jobs story about how you can only join the dots facing backwards. You can't join the dots facing forward. So, had you asked me what I was going to do when I was at school or at university or as I started work or at business school or doing all the others, I did some quite crazy things, skiing and so on. I would never have been able to say, well, I would be this kind of commentator, advisor, investor around net zero. But when I look back at all the different things I've done, I'm drawing on all that experience just all the time. And so that journey, it did start with a lot of physics at school. It started with a lot of engineering. And, I now know that it was energy engineering at university. I did lots of microeconomic modeling in my first job, learning curves, and penetration, sort of logistic penetration, these S curves. Business school, I did a lot of finance. In parallel, I was doing a lot of skiing. I was competing. So I was out, spending time in these very fragile environments, which kind of attune you to the problems of climate change. And then even working, after business school, more consulting. It was more around, it was McKinsey, it was change management. A lot of it was around logistics, supply chains, the food industry, and then into media, where I was deputy managing director of Associated Press Television. So that is both about spending time with these journalists who've got an incredible sort of nose for a story, and how do you communicate and how do you create the myths and the narratives that can change the world, but also how do you run an international media business? How do you gather information around the world? How do you edit? How do you direct people's attention to different things? How do you maintain quality? And so in a way that led, although there was a sort of detour around dot-com boom bust and all sorts of things, but basically all of those threads came to, even the dot-com boom bust was all about TCP/IP technology and how do you have distributed resources. So, we could not have virtual power plants today without the internet. We would not be able to do a lot of the things around distributed energy, or how do you control your heating from your mobile phone, all of that. So even that, there was a kind of a dot that got joined up when I founded New Energy Finance. And that's where we first met. I was providing information, analysis, insight, forecasting, narratives, stories, myths, whatever you want to call it, around what was then just clean energy, but of course is now really seen as net zero technologies, climate technologies, and environmental technologies more broadly.
Exactly. And I sometimes like to say that a strategy is a branch of history, but insight is a different expertise altogether, and it's separate from foresight. But when you started New Energy, finance. Did you foresee how successful it would be, how omnipresent it would grow to be?
Absolutely not. I was coming off the back of a few very, hardworking years in the dot-com boom bust, the TMT boom bust period around sort of 1998 through till 2000. In fact, even before then, there'd never been a year when I hadn't been, working like crazy and skiing like crazy. And suddenly, the bottom fell out of my world, my career, everything, because everybody I knew lost their job. And I'd started all these companies, or I'd helped, or I'd funded, or I'd supported, all of them. Funnily enough, all of them survived, bar I think one, like 20, 25 companies, but they all got sold for scrap to different investors or different corporate acquirers. And I was left high and dry with very little money, having been worth at one point along that path $30 million. I'd sort of thought that I'd get 2 or 3 million out, and at the very least, 10% would be a good target, given that I knew it was a bubble. I ended up with literally getting 1% out. I got about $300,000, £200,000 out, and was left, with no career, no network, no mentors, no nothing. It had all been, it had been like a neutron bomb dropped on everything that I had done. And I started New Energy Finance. It was almost like everything I was interested in and spending time on was around climate and clean energy. And so I kind of hustled together, some information, some thoughts on services. But at no point at that time did I think I was going to create this behemoth that was going to, inform a trillion. I think Bloomberg's figures from last year, $1.1 trillion was invested in the net zero transition in 2022. Well, in 2004, when I started, that figure was 32 billion, right? So the whole industry was only 32 billion. And I had no way of knowing that I could be the dominant information provider or a useful thought leader. I was just kind of doing the only thing I knew how to do, the only thing that used all those dots in my past, and I put it together and I created a service. And then, the rest just kind of boomeranged or snowballed.
It's an amazing story, actually, and we all love a great redemption story. But did you just say that the market has grown 1,000-fold since you started New Energy Finance, or did I get that right?
I don't think your maths is right there. Probably my numbers might have been wrong. But when I started, there was $32 billion globally invested in renewables.
Right.
And that's now just under $500 billion. But on top of that, you've got to add the electric vehicles, which is another nearly $500 billion, and then various things like electrical heating and some of the other, power storage, grid connected storage, and so on. And you add all of that together, and Bloomberg, so the team that I created of analysts that I now, I write for Bloomberg, but I don't run them in any way, have no executive role. But last year they said that was 1.1 trillion. So I think that means that it's a kind of 35-fold increase in investment.
Okay, well, we'll settle for that for the moment then. But do you foresee that rate of change continuing?
Well, so in a way, yes. I mean, you couldn't have a growth, that was a 20-year period, or it was 2004 to 2022, so an 18-year period. We're not going to see another 35x growth in investment in the transition in the next 18 years. Nor do we need that. That's even more than you would need for 1.5 degrees or anything. But we do need to see another, 5x or 7x, and hopefully we will see that. Do I expect us to see that? I mean, I'm a pessimist and an optimist. If you're optimistic, I'll be pessimistic. If you're pessimistic, I'll be optimistic. I'm sure it will double or triple in the next decade. Will that be enough to get to 1.5 degrees? No. But I've also written something on the next category. So if you look at renewables, went from 32 billion to $500 billion. Electric vehicles 10 years later went from zero when Elon Musk came along to $500 billion now. The next one I think is going to be electric heating. A lot of people are very excited about hydrogen, and that'll be part of the future, but it won't get to this kind of $500 billion a year, which is my benchmark for, is it going to really move the needle? Well, hydrogen will, but electric heating, both domestic and industrial, is going to be the next big kind of breakout category?
So I'd like to come to that in a minute, but I'm stuck on something very simple here. To most people's mind, renewables is just taking off, and you should expect there to be a boom from here. And you seem to be a bit cautious about it. Have I got that right?
Well, renewables is not taking off. The funny thing is, I used to do a load of stuff with the World Economic Forum, and they put me into this thing called the Global Agenda Council on alternative energy. And even back in 2012, 2013, I was like, why is it alternative? If you look at the budget, if you look at the capital budget of the average utility in the world, already by then, 50% of it was going on renewables. So what is alternative about that? And of course, now we don't call it alternative energy because now that number is, 80% of the capital budget of your average utility, if not more. So I'm looking at renewables as it has already scaled and it will continue. I mean, if you look at, let's say, solar, some amazing statistics. When I started New Energy Finance, it took a whole year to add a gigawatt of solar capacity. And then in 2008, it took a month. 2016, it took a week. And nowadays it takes a day. Now, I suppose there is a question about how many more of those kind of step changes can there be? When the solar industry this year will install something like 450 gigawatts of capacity, because it'll go through that one every 365 will be one a day. It'll go through that. The manufacturing capacity of solar grade silicon is already a terawatt. So the industry is already in some ways looking at a terawatt per year, or 1,000 gigawatts of installation. Will it go to 10 terawatts, 100 terawatts? I mean, that's really kind of almost like crazy speak, even for something like solar.
Well, so do you mean you think the cost curves that have been driving solar are going to flatten out then?
So cost curves, value add curve, the cost of value add never bottoms out. I mean, you've got sort of weird industries like nuclear where you have actual loss of knowledge because the cycles are so slow that people retire and you lose knowledge. And also your regulatory environment just becomes tougher and tougher and tougher. So it becomes more and more expensive. But most things in the world, I mean, this is the great, I'd say, one of the dots, joining up the dots backwards in my career was my first proper job. I don't count, working in a clothes shop or on a car production line, putting myself through college. My first proper job as an analyst was calculating learning curves. And I did it for bizarre industries. I did it for printed circuit boards and the very beginnings of fiber for telecoms communications. But I also did it for things like rock quarrying and oil platforms. And so I have this kind of almost religious belief, but it's not a belief. It's a conviction based on data that as humans accrue knowledge and as they invest and build scale and logistics, and also as ideas kind of mate and incur progeny, there's this kind of process of there's something very organic about my view of the economy. It's not classical economics. It's very much about evolutionary economics. And so, you get this learning. It just accrues in the economy and drives down costs. At the moment, we've got a spike in costs, and that's driven by commodity prices and also driven by this thing that you and I grew up with, but most people listening might not have, which is called inflation. The costs go up, not the real costs, but we've had sort of 15 years where we've barely had to distinguish, more than 15, 20, 25 years, we haven't had to distinguish between real and nominal in our statistics. You just kind of name a number and it's kind of, do you mean real or nominal? It's like, well, either, it doesn't matter. Well, I tell you what, if inflation is going to keep running at 4%, 6%, and it's obviously spiked recently much higher, you really need to talk about real costs. So real costs will come down, adjusted for commodity cycles. And at the moment, the commodity cycle is high. And I was talking to Paddy Padmanathan, who was responsible for some of these very, very, very cheap solar projects in the GCC region. And he reckoned that projects that had recently cost $10.50 per megawatt hour, if you did them today, would be $16 or $17 per megawatt hour, but that in 4 or 5 years, they'll be back to costing $10.50 or even less.
Right. So, and I guess you're saying the cost curves around the technology will persist. There may be some interim blips on the cost of raw materials or indeed labour and all the other costs that go into things, but we shouldn't get distracted by them. But even though solar is already probably the cheapest form of energy, we're not going to see massive change in the rate of rollout from your perspective.
No, and the important thing is that when it will slow down year on year, it will slow down because the growth rates. So the way a learning curve works, as I learned back when I was in my early 20s, is that you get approximately the same cost reduction for every doubling of a cumulative volume, a cumulative knowledge, cumulative logistics investment, etc. And that continues. The thing is that those doublings, if you talk about rock quarrying, then it takes us 50 years or 75 years to double all the rock that's ever been quarried in the history of the world. Whereas, of course, in chips, because Moore's law is just a manifestation of the same thing, it takes, 18 months to halve. So it probably only takes 9 months to double the cumulative volume of chips that have been produced. And so you end up with these very consistent curves, but over time, rather than doublings, they actually slow down. So solar, it will slow down. You will not see these kind of 20% per year reductions, but you will see 20% per doubling, or in fact 25% or more.
So this is just going to keep happening. We've broken the back of the problem. And what then remain the biggest challenges standing in the way of getting us towards net zero? Because it's not then the renewables technology anymore.
Well, did you know that it's not sunny at night? And that's a big problem if you just postulate that it's going to be solar. And of course, these experience curves have also driven down the cost of wind. Wind is a little bit more heavy engineering. I said that solar, the experience curve is 25% or more. It might be even 26, 28, some people think. Wind, it's more like sort of 16, 18, maybe 20, depends. But it's because there's a lot more just kind of, and these learning curves are also amalgams of, in wind, a lot of it is things like welding, where we've been doing a lot of that. So it's not all new in the way that, let's say, solar is. So those curves will continue. And of course, there are other cost curves, other products. I mean, even things like smart meters, and we should talk, digitization is almost more than a cost curve because that's network benefits. But we've also got batteries and we've got electrolyzers clearly going to play a huge role in net zero and also coming very rapidly down these cost curves.
You should be really honest. I'm interrupting, but I must say this. If I just listen to you, I'd say, this is great, we've cracked it. We shouldn't have a problem. But yet you're not always an optimist, right? So help me understand that.
What we need is energy when we need it. It's not energy when the sun shines or when the wind chooses to blow. And so there's a lot of different technologies that are required, or a lot of different interventions required in order to map this very cheap renewables onto this this demand for very high reliability that we have. And there are also, we shouldn't get too mesmerized by electricity, because electricity is only 20% meets only 20% of current energy demand. You've also got transport, you've got heating, and you've got lots of industrial processes. And some of those really, really want to work 24/7. And some of them, in some cases, for 15 or 20 years without stopping.
You say some of those will go electric. Heating will go electric, you said. Transport, is going electric to a fairly high degree. We can see it in front of us. So why does the world not just go electric then?
Well, so if you take an industry, let's take the glass industry, it will go electric because fundamentally burning stuff to heat things up is an enormous it's very wasteful. It's just inherently wasteful in the engineering. All joules of energy are equal, but some are more equal than others. And what you don't want to do is make a fuel where you don't need to and then burn it to make heat. And it's much more efficient to go straight from electricity, and there's efficiency on the supply side, on the demand side, and so on. The problem is that if you need 24/7 reliable heat, then you've got a problem if you're getting that from the sun and it's going on and off every day. And in fact, by the way, you might have a monsoon, or you might have a rainy season, or you might have this thing called winter. So you've invested enormous amounts in your glass plant, and now you get some Charlie who's trying to say, oh, well, only turn on the heaters, part of it. So you need to buffer and you need to smooth things out. And we need to invest, I think it's really important also to talk about resilience, even in the electrical use, right? We're talking about economy that will have all of the electricity, all the electrical uses we currently have, lighting, dishwashers, computers, media, everything we currently do electrically, dialysis machines, all sorts of things. You're also going to have heating for all the old people who can't survive without heat. And, I've helped to put in resilient heating into a neonatal intensive care unit in Africa. I mean, we're talking about there are some people, some babies there that will die in 20 minutes if they don't have heat and oxygen, right? Mm. But then you've got space heating to add to that, transport to add to that, and lots of industrial heat. And by the way, even if you don't agree with the glass industry and the cement industry, a lot of industrial heat is low temperature and mid temperature, which will all go to heat pumps because they're so efficient. The problem we've got is we cannot afford a power cut. It's not just that our computers will go down and our lights will go off and we'll have to find a candle. Now there's no heating. There's nothing. The whole thing. There's no police cars. There's no fire engines, because all of that's going to be electric as well. So we really need to invest in resilience. So, I mean, I think where you're going with this is, have we reached the end of innovation?
I wasn't quite there, but I think you're pointing to where I was going, which is the areas where innovation is needed is changing. So it's because you're pointing to storage, distribution, resilience, intelligence, but I'm summarizing what I think you're saying. Tell me if I've got it right.
No, that's right. I mean, so what you've got is this very cheap supply of electricity, but the mapping of that onto society's needs, it has got lots of holes. It's a bit of a Swiss cheese. We can do a lot of it, but we can't do all of it. And of course, the other thing that we really need to flag is that, it's like the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. Remember that we may be at, 60% clean electricity in the UK, but you've still got large swathes of the world, particularly in Africa, where they don't have electricity at all. And I don't think it's appropriate to say, well, they should put a little solar panel on their roof and be happy if they've just got lighting and if they can watch the World Cup on the telly, but no industry, please, and, no advanced healthcare or, all the other things you need really resilient energy for, really resilient electricity.
So I think you're saying to those who would say, we've cracked it, we just need to roll out what we've got. We shouldn't be putting money into innovation because it's going to take too long. You'd sort of say, well, it won't really work.
Look, there's this debate about should we roll out what we've got or should we invent new stuff? Right. And it's a fabulous and entertaining discussion. In fact, I got involved. There was Vinod Khosla wrote something for The Economist saying wind and solar, we shouldn't be investing because they don't provide this thing called base load. And so I was very lucky because they gave me an opportunity. The Economist gave me an opportunity to respond. And I wrote my own byline where I said, look, first of all, base load is kind of dead. It was the way you designed electrical systems in the 19th and 20th century. But we don't now. What we do is we grab this very cheap renewable electricity and then we sort of patch it up with other things. So we deliver the cheapness to the consumer and the resilience. So two areas that we need innovation. One is that process that we've been talking about of getting the cheap renewables to the consumer in a way that's resilient, reliable, ubiquitous, etc. The other thing is that we don't know how much energy we might need. But I think it's fair to say there will never be a world where vast amounts of very cheap energy won't be valued, useful, and it could be they are absolutely essential. I mean, I'm thinking of supposing we overshoot. We're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees, right? Nobody wants to admit it, but I'm happy to admit it. I came to grips with that about 5 years ago. But if we start overshooting 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, there's a very high likelihood of things getting extremely nonlinear. And we may have to then expend vast amounts of energy. They better be, of course, it has to be low, zero carbon energy in capturing CO2, in restoring the planet's climate. Now, if we have to do that, that is orders of magnitude more energy than the economy will need, and a new source of vast amounts of clean. So if fusion works in 2050, 2060, I think we'll still be using it. I think we'll find a use for it.
So we'll never have surplus energy because it's just too useful and we'll always use it. And actually, put you on the spot, where do you think we are trending to in terms of global warming or climate chaos, if you prefer?
Well, so there's a number of parts to that answer. One is, where do I think emissions are going?
Right.
Where I think I'm as expert as pretty much anybody, would need to be. And I'm, in line with the IEA and all the very good energy modelers. The other thing, though, is what temperature does that drive the planet to?
Exactly.
And the third piece is, what does that do? Right? And this matches, by the way, the IPCC's different working groups. So what are the emissions is working group 3. What does it do to the planet? Working group 1. What about what does it do to the mosquitoes, the floods, the humans, et cetera, et cetera? That's working group 2. So on the emissions, we are on track for, if you look at those IPCC scenarios, there are some very severe ones. And it's, for those who are, following and who are expert on this, RCP 8.5 is, you've got that Chinese boom in coal from 1995 or 2000 through till about 2010. We just do a dotted line, we expand that out and say, that's where we're going. Well, that's absolutely extreme. That's the sort of 5 degrees, 7 degrees of warming, catastrophic within a human lifetime, and we're not going there. Just the energy system is not going there. The coal is not happening. Coal has peaked in 10 years ago. Now, at the other end, there's the scenario, the 1.5 scenario, which is RCP, I think it's 1.6 or 1.6 or 1.9. And we're not going there either, right? We've already built too much coal, oil, gas, deforestation. That would be the one consistent with 1.5 degrees, and we're not going there. Where are we going? We're going somewhere in the middle area. So in technical terms, RCP 3.5, 4.4, even 4.5, we're probably not going there. Right. What that means in practice is we are at or very close to peak emissions.
Right.
We're pretty much have flattened the curve. Those charts that show emissions soaring away and everybody saying, oh, we're not doing anything and you grown-ups have let us all down and so on. That's not what's happening. What's actually happening is emissions are pretty much at a peak.
Right, but that still means we're pumping a lot of
oh, absolutely. So that's the annual emissions, which are not going up, but they're not going down either yet.
Right.
And of course, concentrations, which is what drives climate, are still going up. So what we need to do is those emissions need to go down to zero, as we know, by 2050, which I think is impossible. I think it'll be 2070. But so those emissions need to go down. But, if you want to get emissions to net zero, you first have to go through a plateau or through a peak of some sort. So it's like, okay, have we achieved the peak? Yeah, pretty much. We're on track for this kind of middle scenario where it peaks and then it declines slowly. We're not on the one where it declines quickly to zero. It declines slowly. And therefore, at the moment, we're probably on track for, I think the best analysis of all of that says that it's kind of 2.6 degrees.
Wow.
Now, I think, because I'm a techno-optimist, and I think you've got some great companies in your portfolio at ETF that will help bend the curve, and others do as well, I think we can still come in under 2 degrees. So exactly what the Paris Agreement says, I think we can get, so let's call it 1.8, 1.9. That's doable.
No, well, thank you for coming out with a number. And, sitting here looking at the temperature around Europe, I hope we do. And I think you're saying all these technologies are really needed.
Oh, absolutely. I just wanted to, just very briefly to round out, because I said there's 3 parts. So, let's assume that, with my optimist hat on, let me say, I think we can get to 1.8. It's not 1.5, but Paris says well below 2, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is there's these other 2 pieces. Number one, it is possible that those emissions, flat and receding, actually drive the temperature more. There's uncertainty bands around that. How does the planetary system respond? You could do exactly that output of emissions and it ends up at 2.8 or 3 degrees. But the third piece also, and that's the one that we're also learning a huge amount about with every passing year, is that 10 years ago, 1.8 degrees, we might have said, well, you know what, that's going to be good enough. But now we look around, look at the temperatures today, and that's at 1.2 degrees of warming. What does 1.8 look like? Worse, right? So the impacts of climate change look more severe than we thought. So it's kind of like we may declare victory over emissions, but find that either the uncertainty bounds or the impacts on the different ecosystems, et cetera, could be much, much worse than we think. So basically, I'm optimistic, but still scared.
No, I think that's fair. And I think you're saying, although we might not do too badly on the average global temperature rise, but the divergence from average can still be acute through the year. Because actually, look at the temperatures around North America, around Southern Europe. It's crazy.
Yeah, and of course, things like a coral reef doesn't care about the average temperature over 3 decades. It cares about the one bleaching, event that is so severe that it can't recover. That's it. The rest, it could be fine. The rest of the 3 decades, the water temperature could be perfect.
So we need to keep rolling out renewables. It's not the end of the story. There's a lot of new tech, new innovation required around storage, distribution, intelligence, resilience. It sounds like there's a lot required around mitigation and adaptation as well.
I was going to say, and adaptation, absolutely. And, in some ways, when I look at some of the discourse, some of the public debate, it frustrates me because, you'll have people, I will say things like, we're not on track for 5 degrees of warming. And I get attacked. It's like, oh, I'm a denier and I'm a this and I'm a that. I'm like, look, I'm just telling you from my knowledge of the energy system and my interpretation of the science in those other 2 areas, we're going to end up around 2.5, maybe, 2.8, somewhere around there. That's just it. But then I get told that, that I wouldn't be so complacent if I lived in the Horn of Africa, which has got this fearsome drought going on. So 100% true. However, what I can't jump to is the idea that to help people in the Horn of Africa, the best thing to do is to jump on a plane, fly to China and try to persuade them to close some coal-fired power stations, as opposed to direct adaptation interventions in the Horn of Africa. Yeah. And of course, where the debate ought to kind of meet in the middle is, well, we need to do both. Right. We need to do both. So we've got to help the people because, even if I'm at my most optimistic 1.8 degrees and no nasties happen, there's still people who will suffer horribly. The vulnerable, the poor, those most exposed will suffer. So we've got to, whatever we do on the innovation, on the mitigation side, we've got to pair it dollar for dollar or even more with continuing to help people adapt and help people harden their infrastructure, their lifestyles, their crop variants, et cetera, et cetera.
And honestly, I think one of the rate limiting steps is the ability to have a just transition, not just because it's just, but because that's what people will accept. So it's a political problem, surely, as well as a technological problem.
It is, but again, I think we still got to be, we're not as nuanced in what we mean by a just transition. So the terminology comes out of, and said with the greatest respect, the left, but it tends to focus on inclusion, questions of inclusion. So communities not having things done to them, but being involved and also benefiting, where there are costs, but there are also benefits. The marginalized community is benefiting. And that's absolutely 100% part of what we're talking about. But a just transition is also cheap energy and, cheap services, because it's easy for us to sit here and say we should have a carbon price. And, it's ridiculous that we can fly to, wherever for $50. But, if that's your only way of visiting your relative, or if you need a car to get to work, and somebody wants to, put, and we see, the yellow vest protests, the BBB farmers movement in Holland. We saw, the idiotic Trump pushback against wind energy, but, channeling a lot of malaise amongst people seeing energy costs going up and so on. So a just transition has to bear in mind, we're only going to win if we can fundamentally push down. And this is the core role of innovation. Push down the costs of solutions. Because if the answer to climate change is sacrifice, I got news for you. We're going to a very, very unpleasant place. But if the answer is innovation and actually improving, electric cars are better than gas cars, and heat pump heating is more comfortable than gas heating and safer from a nitrous oxides perspective. We've got to push the benefits, not just regulate against the bad stuff that we don't like.
I completely agree, and I hate agreeing with you, so I'm going to move the conversation on a little bit, because I'd like to get your perspective on the different types of innovation. There's a lot of big industrial groups pushing carbon capture and storage as being needed because otherwise we'll never change enough, and yet others would say, hold on a minute, this is a 20-year project, and we don't have 20 years, and you need different types of innovation that are more rapid and easy to deploy. Give me your perspective on this.
So let me deal with this question of we shouldn't do big things because they take too long.
Right.
The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So I'm sorry, but those people who say, nuclear, you've missed it, it'll take too long, or carbon capture and storage, or fusion, or whatever. I'm like, no, we need to do that stuff because there will never be a time when we don't need more clean energy, and we can't guarantee that we can achieve 100% of all the things we need with the current, basket of quick technologies, let's call them. So we definitely need to do that. And, it's a portfolio management project, right? We're financial folks. You don't put all of your money into something that might work in 20 years, but nor do you say we write it off. You put a certain percentage, and so you risk manage within the portfolio of options. But I think, your question also raised another that specifically CCS, and there's within all of this sort of ecosystem. I said that I have an evolutionary view of the economy. Within that ecosystem of players, there are also, I don't want to say bad actors, but there's all sorts of different actors, and they are not optimizing for, evolution doesn't optimize for the good of the collective. You've got the selfish gene going on where each species optimizes for itself, or each individual, actually it's the selfish gene operates at an individual level. So individual oil company, individual gas company, individual, they act for themselves, and, you can turn it into fiduciary responsibility to put it in financial terms. They're actually set up by law to operate on behalf of either their shareholders or their pension beneficiaries or life insurance beneficiaries. And so we get a lot of pathologies. If you look at it from the whole, you would say that they're pathologies, right, but they are part of the system. And, that I started by saying I spent some time in the news industry, which gave me a bit of an appreciation for narratives and stories and we need, politics is kind of the art of storytelling to get things done. But so is business. So is, in a sense, so is everything. And, when we hear some of these stories, we can't just say that's wrong, that's going to result in disaster. We need to come up with better stories. Right. But if you don't like CCS, tell me how you are going to provide cheap energy to the less well-off, the less advantaged, in a safer, better, more convenient form. Because if you can't do that, then I'm afraid you leave the battlefield to the people you don't like.
That's actually a really interesting point, because I think what comes from that is so many people try to lobby government with data, and it doesn't seem to work. And you're kind of saying we should be lobbying with narrative.
Well, we should. I still think the most persuasive thing is actually doing stuff. Right. And because narratives, as an example, so I'm now going to, I don't know if I'm contradicting myself, but I'll give you a counter example. Hydrogen boilers in the UK, right? That's absolutely on the narrative's front lines, right? You've got the oil, gas, fossil, and also some of the innovation crowd, and a lot of, sort of wishful thinking, a lot of politicians as well. So when, it sounds so easy, you get this clean thing, you burn it, only makes water. Wouldn't it be nice if? So there's a kind of a confluence of venal and dreamer, venality and dreams and all sorts, that says hydrogen for heating. And all of the people, all of the analysts, everybody who is not paid for by a gas company has basically said that it just won't work. The thermodynamics is so poor, the costs are so high, the danger, the nitrous oxides you can add on top. But fundamentally, it's a stupid idea. It's not stupid. You can call it that's a pejorative term, but it doesn't win any cost benefit analysis. 42 reports agree, and yet there's a big chunk of people that simply reject that. They want to continue to believe, and the only thing that will persuade them is in fact trying to do it and failing.
Okay.
And conversely, trying to do it and making a huge success of it, as Elon Musk did with the Tesla, is entirely persuasive. So that's the most persuasive thing. But the narratives are needed because, the narratives kind of connect the entrepreneur with society, with history, with a vision of the future, with aspirations. And, I do think that too many people who are working on climate, they either are technocrats, so they don't really see the value of the narrative. They think, well, I've proven that there's the equivalent of an ozone hole, so that we should just do the same thing and ban all the things that cause the we ban chlorofluorocarbons, we just ban, oil, gas, and coal, and we're kind of done. But they're also, even if they are in the narratives business, they are telling narratives to people like themselves.
Right. So
they don't say, well, actually, the blocker here is somebody entirely not like myself.
Right. And I'm glad we got to this point, because it's a good one to try and summarize on, I think, because a lot of our audience will be entrepreneurs or people who support entrepreneurs. And I think one of the lessons from listening to you is actually not the power of data, it's the power of narrative and clarity of communication. And this is your expert field, actually, communication. So I'd love for you to leave a final thought on communication as an entrepreneur. And I know this is slightly off what we were talking about on some level, but I think you're saying that if people really want to make a difference, they need to communicate with exceptional clarity around these subjects.
There's no doubt in that. I guess as an entrepreneur, though, you're communicating with lots and lots of different stakeholders, and primarily investors, people like yourself, and also staff, your team. Also to the wider society, although most earlier, smaller entrepreneurs, if you need to change the law on something, if you need to kind of get everybody to understand that we need to invest in the transmission and change planning laws before you can sell your smart transmission technology, you're probably going to fail. And I think there are so many lessons for entrepreneurs that, I see entrepreneurs all the time who they're very good. They'll come in with the presentation. The first 5, you've seen this a million times. The first 5 or 10 pages are about the polar bears and the climate change and the emissions and about the need to. And it's like, look, you're the entrepreneur. Forget it. You're not going to sell a single widget by starting a presentation with 10 pages of polar bears and your grandkids. The question is, what does your thing do? But staff are more complicated because some of them will want to understand. And I was very lucky building New Energy Finance that I could explain that what we were doing. I was building a little information business, tiny little thing compared to Reuters or Bloomberg or whoever, Thompson at the time. But we were also doing this really important thing. We were the people who understood these mega trends and how to resolve them and how to bring hope to people and so on. So there was an element of that.
Well, whenever I listened to you, there was that sense of mission. The world needs this information, and the information will change the world. That sense of mission and story was always there. And I think it's one of the reasons you succeeded with your business, actually.
I do. Well, it definitely was, because I could recruit people and pay lower salaries than other people. I had, more interns with more talent, some of whom are now, by the way, highly paid directors at Bloomberg, and others have gone off to Goldman Sachs and all over the place. But I was able to bring together, I call it weaving the cable, because not all of them, by the way, wanted to save the world. Some of them were just physicists who liked doing modeling. And some of them were just, wanted to, they were just salespeople. They didn't care what they sold, but they really liked getting big fat commission checks. But you have to weave the cable out of all these different elements. And each one, you have to kind of understand the narratives that work for them. But yeah, the funny thing is, I now look at entrepreneurs working on, problems that are not connected to the major societal challenges. And just as I said, I don't call them bad actors. I just call them lost souls, because I just don't think it matters if there's a slightly better video game or another brand of mineral water or tonic water. I just can't get excited. I see so many, and in a previous life, I worked in the food industry. I worked in the entertainment media industry. I could easily, in my career, have gone down a route where I was spending all day, every day, working on video games or on new food products. I am so thankful that this bizarre thing happened where I had a brainwave and started New Energy Finance, and and all of the things that flowed from it. My family, my wife, everything has flowed from it. It's such a blessing. I wish more people, more entrepreneurs could kind of get the tumbrils of the lock aligning in the same way, because I tell you, it makes life, a lot better. Let's put it that way.
Michael, thank you. That's kind of wonderful note on which to end. But listening to you, I'm absolutely sure the best is yet to come. Right? But in the meantime, thank you so much. This has been just fun and lovely.
Patrick, hopefully the best is yet to come in one of my roles, helping one of your portfolio companies or some of the other ones I'm involved in. But
that would be ideal. Thank you very much.
Very good. Lovely chatting with you, as always.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Talks podcast. To find out more or join as a guest, head over to the ETF Partners website at etfpartners.capital. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Medium at ETF Partners. Until next time, thanks for listening.